is my it is my absolute pleasure to introduce Dr. Brie Tripp, who is going to facilitate a discussion about how to use scientist spotlights in your classroom. Um, Dr. Tripp is an assistant professor of teaching at University of California, Davis. She has a PhD in biology from Portland State University with an emphasis on biology education research. Her postdoc was at San Francisco State University and focused on measuring inclusive physiology curricula. Her current research focuses on equity and inclusion in undergraduate STEM environments at UC Davis, with one of her main projects being scientist spotlights. So with that, I'm going to hand things off to Brie.
Yeah, thank you, Sally, for that very generous introduction. It's great to be here. I see some familiar faces that I've met you before. Well, I've met you in online spaces because we've been in the pandemic for like a couple of years now. So for those of you, though, that don't know me, I think I'll go ahead and share my screen. Okay, can everybody see my screen? Awesome. Okay, so yeah, today we're gonna go through Scientist Spotlights workshop. But for those of you that don't know me, now you do, because Sally gave such a great introduction. So let's jump right in. Okay, so today we're gonna do a small short activity to start us off, and then we're going to go into what scientist spotlights are. Can I get a raise of hands for those of you that know what scientist spotlights are, just so I know my audience a little bit better? You can use the emoticon to let me know. Okay, so we got about half maybe that are familiar with scientist spotlights. Great. Okay, so we're going to go over what they are. We're going to go over how they promote equity and inclusion in STEM classrooms. And then we're actually going to explore the Scientist Spotlight website. And so Talita did such a good job advertising that. I hope you brought your syllabus with you, because I would like you to leave this discussion today with something tangible that you can actually go forth with and implement into your class. So let's get started. Okay. I want you to think of 3 scientists that you learned about in your undergraduate courses when you were a student. Don't type it into the chat or anything like that. Just think to yourself for a moment. What are 3 scientists you learned about when you were an undergrad? And I'm going to type a link in the chat, and I'd like you to follow that link, and I'd like you to write the last names of these 3 scientists in lowercase letters into the blank boxes at the link in the chat. All right, I see Watson, Crick, Mendel, McClintock, Einstein, Newton, Darwin. Yeah, these are great. So if you just look at the word cloud, we see that we've got these larger words for people that have had similar experiences learning about these spotlights. And then the smaller words are less common, at least the least common ones that people wrote into those 3 categories that you had space to write into. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide. Now I want you to write 3 characteristics they share in lowercase letters again. This can be gender, race, ethnicity, class status, or anything else that they share, characteristics that they share into those 3 boxes in lowercase letters. All right, so if we look at our word cloud now, the most predominant characteristics are white, male, European. We also have upper class, biologists, smart, yeah. But the predominant ones that are listed are white, male, European, men, old. Yeah, thank you for completing that activity with me. I'll just go back to my. All right, so based on those word clouds, I just want you to think to yourself, who does science and who doesn't do science, right? What kind of messages are we sending to students? And the same messages that we got as an undergrad about who exactly does science. And it's not just educational environments that send messages to students about who does science. There's television shows, movies, websites, news articles, advertisements that all convey images of who does science, and they're usually showcasing a relatively narrow view of who exactly does science, as we just saw, right, in our experience when we were undergrads. And this is shifting. We're in this really exciting time where we're starting to shift the types of representation that we want to show students in order to increase students that don't identify with those counter or with those stereotypical descriptors that you all mentioned. And so that's really the whole purpose of scientist spotlights. And I want you to just check in with yourself for a moment. Which scientists do you represent in your classes, if any? Because I know before I started the Scientist Spotlight project, which was right when I started at UC Davis, I never represented any scientists in my courses, right? I always thought, well, students, and I teach physiology. So I know some of the, genetics and such, they usually highlight more scientists that have contributed to the field. But in physiology, I really hadn't at all. And when I first heard of Scientist Spotlights, I was very skeptical. I was like, students aren't going to care about like scientists that are doing research, like they just care about their grade, right? And I think that was speaking from a place of privilege as a white woman, right? But I thought, okay, I'm going to try using these Scientist Spotlights and just see what happens. So we're going to go over exactly what these Scientist Spotlights are and how they promote equity and inclusion. And then that's going to be followed by showing you some data that we collected at UC Davis regarding this project. So what exactly are these? These are assignments, and this may be some review to those of you that are familiar with it, but these are assignments that are embedded throughout a course that highlight counter-stereotypical scientist background and research. So let's go ahead and check one out. So this is the anatomy of every single Scientist Spotlight. And we're going to be looking at a website that houses a huge repository of these types of assignments. And all you have to do is download them, and then they're ready to go. They're ready to be embedded into your classroom. And that's what I really love about Scientist Spotlights is there's not that much effort that we have to do. There are certain things to implement them that's important, which I'll show you, but they're easy to implement. They're easy to put into your classes, and they have huge effects on how students relate to science, particularly those from underserved backgrounds and identities. So this particular spotlight is Veronica Rodriguez, and all spotlights have this picture of them and then a brief biography, just a short paragraph of their biography. And then the next two links, this first one is a deeper dive into their background and how they got to where they're at now. And the second one has to do with whatever research that particular scientist is doing or did in the past. So one of the cool things about Scientist Spotlights is it highlights like researchers that are actually still alive and that are making big contributions to science. So, I see in the chat, Yay for Ryan. He was my student. Yeah. I'll get to the bottom at the bottom where we see the authors. But so there's these two links that students read, and then they complete this assignment, and it's very low stakes. I have students complete these 4 questions. I say, here, please explain, what you learned about these resources and reflect on your learning in 5 sentences. And so students can choose any one of these questions to address. But what I found to be the most relevant questions, so these are like, what is most interesting to you in reviewing these resources? What did you learn? What new questions do you have? But this last one is my favorite, which is, what do these resources tell you about the types of people that do science? So the first time I implemented this, I thought, okay, I'm going to do it exactly like the person that came up with this initiative, Jeff Shinsky. I'm going to do exactly like him. I'm going to just have them choose which question they want to address. But I found that students that chose this last one, their reflections were much richer. And so then the next time I piloted it, I thought, okay, I'm going to have them address that one and any of the other ones that they want, but definitely address that one. And then at the very bottom of every spotlight, well, not every spotlight, but at the bottom of some of the spotlights are a little bit about the author who created this spotlight. And what's really cool about this is there's huge efforts to try and get students to create these because it's really empowering for them. There's data that's going to be coming out soon from one of my collaborators that it's super empowering for them to create their own spotlight that's on a website that has their name and their picture on it. Like, it tickles them, right? And I think it's awesome to center students in this process, particularly students that also come from counter-stereotypical backgrounds. Yeah, so there's that. Okay, so we went over a little bit about what they are. So a few things to keep in mind: these are not a sidebar. So oftentimes, like in textbooks, you see this little box, right, that has a little bit about who created, transposable, or who discovered transposable genes, Barbara McClintock or whatever. And students just gloss over that, right? And so we really want to make sure that when people are implementing these, that they're doing it as a replacement to learn content, not just slapping a slide up and saying, oh, look at this spotlight, this, that, and the other, and not having them actually complete the assignment. And I'll show you why that's important in the data that we're collecting now. It gives us a good idea of why we may want to be more thoughtful in having students actually reflect on it. Okay, so it's important to just look at your syllabus and select where you'd like to connect content to a scientist. So it's also super important to choose a scientist that does research that's directly related to the content that you are teaching. Because if you don't, then students just view it as busy work. And so you really want to empower and motivate students to learn the content by looking at the humanistic side of science, which is what Scientist Spotlights does. It has them read their background, and some of their backgrounds are really powerful. Yeah, so there's also evidence that embedding at least 4 of these into your class increases students' relatability to science, especially students that come from the non-dominant culture. But if you just want to try it out with 1 at first, that's great too. Yeah, so it's also, I think, really important in who you're choosing. So just choosing, if you were to do 4 of these and you only chose people of color, and you didn't choose maybe somebody who has a sexuality identity outside of the dominant culture, queer, or somebody who has a disability, you're just speaking to one part of your audience in a class. And so having at least 4 gives you some variability in who you actually highlight, and therefore you can target more students in your class to give them opportunities to also relate to a scientist. So yeah, one of my colleagues did this, and they did all women across these different identities, but all women. And there was feedback from the men, like, I don't have, like, I can't relate to any of these, you know? So just being thoughtful about the different types of identities that you represent. And then implementation super matters. So I've already talked about this a little bit in terms of it being a replacement to learn content, not a sidebar. And I'll show examples again in a minute here with our data about why this is important. But we've found that showing examples of students' reflections during class has been really beneficial in getting student buy-in and student engagement and excitement for these spotlights. And then talking about lecture content in connection with the scientist. So this kind of goes back to connecting it with content within your course and not having it, you know, uncoupled from the scientists is really important. And then also, like, we all know this, right? We all know this, that students aren't going to buy into something unless they're getting a grade for it sometimes. Not all students, but and fair, like that's how we've trained them to be, very grade focused their whole lives. So asking a quiz or an exam question about the scientist's work or background, I've felt has been really helpful in getting students to engage in meaningful ways with these scientist spotlights. Oh, there's a question in the chat. How much time do the students get for each assignment? So I give them a full week, and they just go into Canvas or whatever your learning management platform is, and they read the resources, and then they fill out the discussion box. And it probably takes them, I don't know, depending on the spotlight, I would say probably an hour or two, especially if you're not grading their responses based on correctness, but grading it just based on completion. Because I mean, some of my students aren't going to understand the research from these scientists very well in these research articles, right? We know that students have a hard time digesting research articles. And if that's not a big component of your class, then you know, they're not going to be quite able to understand it all the time. And that brings me to another point. You can choose spotlights that don't have like a real huge, beefy research article. Some of them are like blogs that the scientist is talking about their research, or sometimes they'll have like a content about a certain thing that's like, for instance, I did one in my class that had to do with the sliding filament theory. I highlighted a scientist about that, and they had a resource that students watched a video about how the sliding filament works. So it doesn't always have to be super hefty duty research articles that students review. And then, so I wanted to just show you kind of how I implement these. Sorry for the weird, I don't know what's going on right there with the words, but so Dr. Ben Perez was somebody that I highlighted as a spotlight in my class. And so I talked about the nervous system, right? We went over nervous system content. And then at the end of that nervous system content, I threw up this slide. And I said, you know, you're going to be learning all about Dr. Perez's research that has to do with glial cells and the huge important role that he played in helping us better understand that role. And so this is all I do. I just show this one slide, and then the next week after the assignments have been complete and the due date is passed, I choose one or two reflections from students to show in class, always anonymous. And so this particular person was responding to, what do these resources tell you about the types of people that do science? And before I read this, Dr. Ben Perez was somebody who had the experience of being in the STEM field with his PhD, working at Stanford as a female. He was assigned a female sex at birth, and then he transitioned to a man while he was still in the STEM field. And so he had a very unique perspective of discrimination that happens against women versus men. So this spotlight is often very, very, very impactful for students, especially for women and people that identify with the LGBTQ population. So this student says, Ben Perez, who transitioned from female to male, was a scientist who advocated against pseudo-evidence that men are better programmed and thus better equipped to run the field of science, as well as instilled the notion that scientists are diverse, come from different cultural and ethnic backgrounds. I really admire Perez for his commitment to advocating against gender bias and feigned scientific evidence that supposedly supported said biases against women in science. His devotion to expanding the diversity of scientists and shying away from the stereotypical male white scientist is inspiring. He fought for LGBTQ people like me to feel more accepted in science. Now that I have the knowledge of who Perez was and what his agenda was, I will forever in part attribute this to him as his legacy. So this is powerful, right? And this isn't just a one-off. I mean, I have countless reflections from students and data that I'll show you in a moment that shows that these really do matter to students. Okay, so I've been reminding you that I'm going to show you data for the last 15 minutes. So let's look at that. So what we did is we implemented 6 scientist spotlights into a non-majors introductory physiology course and then a majors advanced physiology course. And we chose the same 6 spotlights. And before or right at the beginning of class, we sent out a pre-survey that had a list of items and questions on it that I don't have time to show you today. And then the same survey at the end of class for both of these courses. And one item on that survey asks, I know of one or more scientists to whom I can personally relate. And they answered this question on a scale, on a Likert scale, from strongly disagree to strongly agree. And then over here on the y-axis, we have the percentage of students that agreed to this particular prompt. So I want you to make a prediction. And I want you to think about which course had the greatest increase in relatability to scientists. Think about it to yourself for a moment. Don't type it into the chat. All right, so we're going to do something called a chat blast. So I want everyone to answer in the chat their answers, but don't push send yet. Just type it in. Type in whether you thought it was the non-majors or the majors. And on the countdown of 3, we're going to all press enter at the same time. 3, 2, 1, go. Non-majors, non-majors. All right, everybody said, oh, somebody said same, non-majors, one person said majors, majors, non-majors. Okay, so that person that said same is actually correct. We found the significant difference between pre and post in terms of their relatability for both classes. And so you see here for the non-majors, we had 26 students who were identifying or who were personally able to relate. And then after 97. So these numbers swap, right? So 91 students said they disagreed in the beginning, whereas only 20 after. And so these numbers literally flip-flop. And then for our advanced majors, we had about half and half. Half of the students said that they could personally relate to a scientist. Which makes sense because these students were upper division, they were science majors, many of them are pre-med, many of them are on their way to going into some kind of science field. But we still had half that said they couldn't personally relate. And then after 100% of them said that. So you can see how small the p-values are. And so this is really statistically significant. in terms of increasing students' relatability to science. And you might be thinking, well, I wonder, like, was it mostly just students of color that were able to relate more to scientists, or was it white students too? So it was actually both. So there's 74% that said students of color that said, or 74 students of color that said they did agree with that statement, 152 that said they didn't. And then only 26 with 200. But for our white students, about half of them. But look how much it jumped up after. I mean, that's pretty significant. I haven't ran the statistics for this yet because I've just ran this data for the first time and I still need to do that. But white students are also identifying with scientists, whereas before they weren't as much. And so this really is beneficial for all students. And we also broke it down by LGBTQ plus and all the different demographics, but I don't have time to show all that today. So yeah, this is just a little bit of the data. We also did semi-structured interviews with 31 students. And some of our findings were that we found 100% of them shifted their mindset of who can do science. 94% said that they're much more encouraged to pursue science after having experienced scientist spotlights. And this part is particularly of interest to this community because when we asked what aspects of spotlight assignments resonated with you most, 77% said the scientist biographies. 50%, 55% said implementation matters, and 45% said that they really resonated with those reflection questions. So I've had a lot of questions from faculty that said, you know, is it okay if I just put like, you know, a slide up that talks about this one scientist of color or something and have that be it? And I'm like, well, yeah, that's better than nothing for sure. But in order for students to really resonate with this and to get the most out of it, we've found in our data that it actually does require them to really reflect on what they're learning through these resources. I think I saw a hand up. Did I see a hand up? No? Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
So I had a question on the implementation matters because of course one student has seen it one way, right? Did they come up with some things that they said, I wish you had such and such? How did they
so
comment?
The category for implementation matters. Sometimes students are saying, oh, I really loved how Dr. Tripp and Dr. Smith would show examples of student reflections in class because it really let me know how my classmates are thinking about it. Or I really loved that like they paid attention to the scientist and how it connected to the content. So it wasn't just like some one-off. And so all these things that I'm kind of sharing with you all about best ways to implement this come directly from our data. And we're still in the preliminary phases of analyzing the interviews, but this so far has been one of our strongest findings is this implementation matters. And then we also have findings about it relating to student identity and stuff like that, but we're in the infancy of analyzing that. So does that answer your question, Talita?
Yes.
Okay, cool. All right, so let me stop talking now and let's explore the website. But before I do that, I wanted to just take a pause and see if anybody had any questions. Rachel.
Hi there. I wonder, you mentioned that one faculty member only used female spotlights. And I wonder if there's what your thoughts are in including some white male spotlights, you know, heterosexual. I mean, I think it's great to highlight diverse scientists, but it's not representative, which we're trying to get away from anyway. So I don't have a very clear question, but maybe you can kind of comment on what I'm trying to ask.
Totally. I totally get what you're trying to ask. And, you know, my response to that question, usually you're not the first person that asked it, is that oftentimes that's all students see is these these stereotypical scientists. And so they've seen it their whole lives. I have not had the feedback yet from students that said that I felt like my identity wasn't in here and therefore I didn't like scientist spotlights. And it's also the way you talk about them. So for instance, I showed a reflection from a student that said like, oh, it's nice to see. So that one reflection I showed you, I think it was the same one. It's really nice to see, you know, someone who's not, you know, who's not the stereotypical male. And so I showed that in class and I said, I just want to point out how many amazing mentors and people in my life that do science that are white, cisgendered, heterosexual, and I couldn't have been in this place without them. And so I try and frame it in a way that honors the students that don't actually identify with those things. You wouldn't be able to use a spotlight like with the background and everything from the website if it was your white, cis, het male, because this is a space to center the voices and the work of people of color and people that don't fit the dominant culture. But I have yet to find a student, at least they don't share it with me, that didn't like the spotlights. And also we do a lot of like scientists that are neurodiverse, that are white, cis, heterosexual men. So they do see parts of their identity highlighted still. We don't just highlight students or scientists of color or anything like that. So just because all of their identities don't identify with that scientist, some of their identities will, by choosing a diversity of a diverse set of scientists in your class. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, totally. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Could you please give an example where you substituted scientist spotlights in place of content? So I'm going to put that one on hold because I want us to get to the website so you all can make an account and start looking at these scientist spotlights. But if you've got time at the end, Robin, I'm happy to stay behind and I'll talk all about that. Or maybe if we have time at the end. But I do want people to get their hands wet with looking at scientist spotlights and seeing maybe if they can find an area or a scientist spotlight that aligns directly with their content. Is that okay, Robin? Okay, perfect. All right, so I'd like everybody to go ahead and I'm going to link this in the chat. Go ahead and go to that website, scientistspotlights.org, and I'm going to do it with you. All right, so when you get to that website, scientistspotlight.org, let's just accept this, and you scroll down, you'll see, I'll just wait till everybody gets there. Susan says, I'm currently trying unsuccessfully to log in. Any advice? So if you've already made an account before and you forgot that you made an account, that's sometimes the issue. It'll just say like a loading page. So what you have to do is go in and say forgot password, and it'll send you a new password in which you can then change your password and log in.
Okay, if you're using your correct login and password and it's giving you the loading, will resetting your password sometimes let you in? Okay, perfect.
Yep. So if all of you go to GradeSpan, and I don't know what level everybody teaches here, but depending on what level you teach at, selecting that level, and then going and searching for the content area that you're interested in. So say that I want to look at environmental justice, and then press go. And you're going to see spotlights down here. And if you click on one of these spotlights, it's going to prompt you to make an account or log in if you already have an account. So I'd like everybody to go ahead and make an account if you don't have one already. And when you're done making the account, I'd like you to put your favorite color into the chat. I always forget my password too on here. And that's clearly not the password. Oh, it is. Great. Okay. Is anyone still working on it and having trouble accessing, creating an account and accessing scientist spotlights?
Unfortunately, I'm wondering if there's just an issue with my browser, because I reset the password and now it's still giving me the loading screen of death, but.
So what you can try to do is clearing the cache. Sometimes helps. Yeah, try clearing the cache.
I'll just try my best and kind of follow along with what you're doing.
Yeah. We're actually going to spend the next 10 minutes or maybe 5 minutes, 7 minutes, the next 7 minutes, just exploring the website. But try clearing your cache, Susan. So you can then go back to the home page and you can filter by whatever content area. Now, I will say it's easier to find scientist spotlights that will fit the content in your course if you make your filters more general. So if you come over here and push college, and then you come over here and push animal behavior, and then you also enter a scientist that you're interested in, and then push go, it may not come up with anything. So try and just use one of these is my suggestion. And then we're gonna just have a quiet moment to let everybody kind of explore and see what these spotlights are like. Download one if you would like, and searching for content that you'd like to connect a scientist with from your syllabus is really helpful to being able to go away from this workshop and be like, I have something tangible from a workshop. Finally, for once in my life. Sometimes I go to workshops and it's like, I have no idea what I got out of that. So hopefully you'll be able to actually have something to take away from this. Okay, so I think now I'm gonna go ahead and put you into breakout rooms. And I'd like you to talk with your group about what you're finding, what you're noticing, and where you're getting stuck. And then we'll come back at the end to kind of share out about what exactly are people hung up on, and how I can be helpful in trying to wring out those hangups and get us to a place where we're comfortable trying this out in our own classroom. So breakout rooms. Siley, did you? I don't think I can even do breakout rooms with my. Oh, I can.
Yeah, you should be able to.
Okay, perfect. And when you get into your breakout rooms, I'd like the person with the shortest hair to go first in sharing what they're finding and what you're noticing, and maybe what other questions you have and where you're getting stuck. So go ahead and accept the invitation to get into your breakout room, and I'll call you back in a couple moments, maybe 5 minutes.
Brie, I'm not seeing an invitation yet. Did you click OK?
Oh, no.
Excellent.
Thank you. All right. Awesome. So I popped into each room, and there were some really great points people were making about things that maybe they were concerned about, or that they weren't sure how to quite do, or that so, and I only heard from one person in each group, so I'm sure there's more, but would anyone like to volunteer? Some of the things their group talked about as being challenging, or things you had questions about, where you're getting stuck, what you're noticing about some of the spotlights. Stephanie.
Hi, yes, I was just talking about I'm in biology, and I was brand new to Scientist Spotlight today, so first timer. The first scientist that I clicked on, when I clicked on research, it was a scientist I had never heard of. I clicked on research, and it took me straight to amoeba sisters, which if you're in biology, you know your students can find amoeba sisters all by themselves. It might not be the most maybe helpful link. And then the second scientist that I did the same thing, then it took me to an hour-long like Zoom of a webinar that they gave. And so just really, for me, I wouldn't even, like, it's not a negative, it's just before implementing it, I would really want to vet what are they going to get when they click on each of these links to know what I'm sort of sending out there for them to do.
Yeah, and that's an amazing point. So these spotlights, the resources that are in these spotlights range. There's a large range. And the cool thing about it, though, is when you download it, it downloads as a Word doc, and you can modify it. If you find something that's more apropos to the particular content that you're teaching about this scientist, replace it. Or if you want something that's easier than some of the material that's on that spotlight, replace it. It really can be tailored to the needs of whatever it is you're doing. And a lot of faculty run into, well, I won't say that. We have a lot of people to share. So go ahead. Isn't there anyone else that wants to share what they're running into? Lisa.
Yeah. So when I look at it, and I've looked at it before and been thinking about ways to make it work in my classroom. So I was thinking, how do I, like, some of the younger, newer folks are doing very advanced stuff that may not align with what I'm teaching right now and may not be in my field of expertise. And how do I make it, like you said, real integrated into the class, because that's really what I want to do. But align with what I know and what my objectives are.
So that's a great point. So when I'm looking for looking at the spotlights, sometimes their research is out of my expertise too, but it's related to what I'm talking about in class. And what I found is that these assignments really aren't meant to like cement content knowledge for students. What they're really meant to do is to allow students to relate to science. And so I find that the research articles are actually like not that critical. You know, if and I tell students sometimes, this is a research article that you might have a hard time understanding, but what I want you to really pay attention to, skip all the jargon. What is the main message of the article? Like, you don't have to go into detail about it. And I don't take off points for students that are incorrectly saying something about the article, because half the time I'm not sure if they're even right or not, right? Because I'm not an expert in that field either. But I think the real value of these is having students, and don't get me wrong, some students, a lot of students actually, if you do it right, they do connect with whatever research they're doing. But I don't test them on the Scientist Spotlight's research. I may say, what was it that Dr. Adnes researched in one sentence? Then that lets me know that they've done the work. But I don't necessarily, and now one time I did, because students were having these misconceptions about Black and white people based on breast cancer in this article, and I had to dispel some of those things. But in my experience, like, it's not about them learning content through the research article, but rather just connecting content. So at least in my experience, that's what I found to be helpful. Yeah. Emily. Oh, Emily has her hand down.
Sorry, I took it down and didn't realize I was on mute. First, apologies, my camera's not working, so hence the picture. But I had two really quick comments and then a question. So a lot of people in my group were in biology fields and were saying they found a lot of good content that their students could really relate to, and they were could help their students make connections between scientists and research they were on. And I also used to be in biology and had not found the Scientist Spotlight website, but had done similar things and found good content. Now I've totally switched and I'm in physics, and there is a physics tag, but nothing related to what I teach. And so someone else in my group made the great suggestion to have my students make their own Scientist Spotlights since they can post them. So yes. I just wanted to point that out because honestly, it hadn't occurred to me and I thought it was a great suggestion.
Totally.
But here's my question. I actually literally was doing this yesterday with a high school biology class, and I was highlighting a Black woman scientist, and the one Black young woman student I had said, why do we have to do this? I don't care. I don't want to learn about the person. I only care about, I just want to do the experiment we're going to do today. Why are you making us do this? So I'm just wondering if you had ever experienced that. And if you had suggestions. My answer to her, I don't think was the best answer. And she still was like, this is dumb. I don't want to do it.
Sure. You're going to have students that do not care, right? You're going to have those students that do not care. But I haven't found a student that it's harming. And so if I can get the majority of students that I'm helping, right? The majority of students I'm helping, and there's a couple students that do not care, and as long as I'm not causing harm to them, then I say that's a win, right? Like, there's always going to be people that sometimes I think some people just want to go against whatever it is that you're doing because they don't like you as an instructor or something like that. But I mean, it's looking at the majority of who it actually is helping that I try to focus on. I have not yet had a student, well, there was one student in our interviews that said that the actual resources for a particular scientist felt like her culture wasn't being represented correctly. Now that I care about, right? Like that to me, like, if you don't like it, like, okay, great, you don't like it, whatever, right? But if you're feeling harmed by it, that's a problem. And so we're definitely going to highlight that in our paper because that hasn't came up in the scientist spotlight literature yet. Yeah, but the person also said, like, I really liked the other spotlights. I just, you know, this was, I wasn't being, my culture wasn't being represented correctly. And there's a lot of spotlights, it's not going to be perfect, right? Like, there's going to be things that, but that's another reason to really pay attention to. And it's interesting because that particular spotlight is the most popular spotlight among students. They love that spotlight. But this one student was feeling like that spotlight was misrepresenting their culture. So I think being careful about which ones you choose and how they're being represented is important too. And it wasn't the scientist, but the spotlight identity that the student identified with. This particular person was a woman of color who went to a different country to do medicine. And the way that she was talking about it in her podcast that was on the resources for students to review was what the student didn't like. And I think it's important to talk about the things that aren't working for students, because these aren't a silver bullet, right? So thanks for bringing that up.
All right.
Julia,
Yeah, we're, you know, I'm just reminding everyone that we're like past the hour. So if you're happy to stay and continue the conversation, but I just wanted to thank Brie for spending time with us and sharing her expertise with us. And yeah, for those of you who would like to stay back and continue asking questions and being part of the conversation, Brie has graciously offered to spend the next few minutes and stick around. So feel free to do that. Someone, you know, going back to the question that Robin raised, Brie, could you give an example of where you substituted the scientist spotlights, you know, with content in the course?
Yep. Let me share my screen. So if we just go back to the example that I had in my talk about Dr. Ben Perez. So I don't go into huge detail about glial cells in my class. We talk a little bit when we talk about the nervous system, about how they used to be thought that they didn't have much to do with any kind of function within the nervous system, and how this particular individual, Dr. Ben Perez, really highlighted the importance of glial cells. And we talk a little bit about, you know, what benefits glial cells have to the nervous system, how it affects the nervous system. But that's all we go over. And this particular spotlight, as well as the other one I was just talking about, are by and large the most popular. So what students are really gaining from this isn't, I wouldn't say that it's always a greater understanding of content knowledge. I would say that it motivates them to learn in the classroom because they feel represented and they feel like they belong, which is huge, right? So I wouldn't say that, at least in my experience, that students are by and large learning vast amounts of content based on these scientist spotlights, but that they're learning that they belong in science, which to me is much more important than content. Honestly, I'll say it. I know that's probably a faux pas, but that's how I feel. It's like, if you can leave and feel like you belong in science, then I did my job. If you know everything about glial cells or you don't, I don't care. Like, right? So that's kind of my that's how I relate it to content. I connect it to content. And the replacement part is, it's, you know, if I hadn't put in Ben Perez, I would probably go into a little bit more detail about glial cells, but they can learn about it in his paper. It's not too heavy of a load for students. And again, I chose the same 6 spotlights for both an intro non-majors class and an upper division majors class. And we've had similar responses in both those classes about how impactful they were. So that just goes to show, like, and yeah, did students in my intro class understand those research articles? No, probably not. Actually, I know they didn't. Some of them didn't. So like, you know, but that's not the, to me, that's not the point. And
Yeah.
I'll say right now, like, I don't know all the research well for the scientists I spotlight, but if I was also spotlighting Watson and Crick, I don't know all of their research in detail. I know that they discovered the double helix of DNA or whatever it is that they did. But like, when we highlight any scientist, do we really know their research in detail, I guess? So.
Yeah, and also the idea that, you know, in the biology education research community, we're finding more and more that sense of belonging and self-efficacy is as important, if not more, than student learning.
Right.
So, you know, to balance that in your courses as well becomes important.
Right. Yeah, I agree 100%. I think that it is, I mean, I want my students to learn content, right? But if they can feel engaged and motivated because they feel like they belong, then that happens automatically, you know, in my experience, at least.
Yeah. And as someone else shared before, you've given me wonderful ideas on how to actually, you know, I work with honor students, and this would be a fantastic project for them to actually develop a scientist spotlight and submit it to the website.
Yes. And, you know, I also hold a workshop on how to create a scientist spotlight. I have a whole like template that students can use to create them. I know that this particular discussion wasn't about that, but yeah, I do have that. So if you're interested, if you want that, I'm happy to share it.
Yes, please, Brie.
Yes.
Yeah.
We would love that.
Yeah.
Any materials that you would like to share, Brie, you can send them to me and I can then post them on the Slack channel for our community.
Okay.
And drop them into a Google folder.
Yeah, I have to talk with one of my collaborators because she's really the one that did the bulk of the structuring of it to make sure she's okay with that. And if she is, I'm happy to share. I kind of was impulsively saying, yeah, I'll just share it with you. But then I thought, like, oh, I didn't actually do a whole lot with that. I did help with it, but she really was the one that did the heavy lift on it. So let me just check with her first, and then I'll get back to you. Yeah, and I'll share these slides too if people want them.
Yes, we would love them.
Okay.
Any other questions for Brie, or comments or thoughts?
Brie, I just noticed that Scientist Spotlights doesn't have a Twitter. I was going to put it in your tweet. And I know people are probably leaving Twitter en masse. They're probably leaving en masse now. But
hashtag science.
Yeah, like from the website, like usually there's like a contact or there's something that you could link it to.
That is a great point, and I will let the person that started this initiative know that would be helpful.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so.
They've got lots of swag. Look at this. If we were in person, wait, can you see it? If we were in person, I'd be able to give you a Scientist Spotlight sticker. Oh my gosh, that's so blurry. You can't even see it. There you go. Oh, there we go. But we're not. So, yeah,